Good morning. My name is Patsy Lewis, and I'm Director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. It's my pleasure to invite you all to what is the third in our series of talks by our affiliated faculty. And this morning, the person who is going to speak about her work is Professor Dixa Ramírez D'Oleo. And the title of her talk is Indolence, Insolence, and Blackness in the Hills. Professor Ramírez is Associate Professor of American Studies and English at Brown. Her research and teaching focus on the literatures and histories of the extended Caribbean, especially the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Her first book, Colonial Phantoms, Belonging and Refusal in the Dominican Americas, from the 19th century to the present, received the 2019 Barbara Christian Literary Award from the Caribbean Studies Association. Her second book, Blackness in the Hills and the Photographic Negative, is forthcoming from Duke University Press. A third book, a long essay on the ecological turn and the grotesque, is under contract with Cambridge University Press. Her writing has been published in ASAP Journal, Atlantic Studies, Avidly, The Black Scholar, Comparative Literature, Hyperallergic, and Los Angeles Review of Books. The Los Angeles Review of Books, Small Acts, and Social Text. She also serves on the editorial committee of Small Acts and the Motherboard of the Association for the Study of the Arts of the Present. It is my pleasure to invite Professor Ramírez D'Oleo to give her talk. Please feel free to raise your questions in the Q&A function, and you don't have to wait until she's finished. Professor Ramírez, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Lewis, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to thank you for inviting me to share my work with you today. And thank you to Kate Goldman for all her help organizing. It's really exciting to see some familiar faces, by which I mean names. I can't actually see you. Let me share my screen. I have a slideshow with some pretty simple quotes, but also there's some imagery I would like to share. Okay, great. And please do let me know if you cannot see my screen. You should see the title of today's talk. Is that correct?
Yeah,
you're good.
Yes.
Perfect. So today my talk is called Indolence, Insolence, and Blackness in the Hills. And I'm excited to share this work with you, which is new, and it's forthcoming for a special issue of the journal Interventions, and it's also a small section of my forthcoming book, Blackness in the Hills and the Photographic Negative. Soon after the 2010 earthquake that devastated Haiti and which attracted foreign vultures eager to feast on disaster and Black pain, Haitian anthropologist Gina Ulysses wrote a book called Why Haiti Needs New Narratives. I heed Ulysses' call, adding that Haiti's neighbor next door, the Dominican Republic, also needs new narratives written from a perspective that is specific to this island's unique history as an island emancipated by the sheer force of Black rebellion on the western side and Haitian governance on the eastern side. The narrative I build today is not a story of identity, the nation, or even activism. For many of these stories surge out of desires to belong to the world as it is, or to place literary and historical subjects into the world as it is. Indeed, the story I tell today dwells in that which hides in the brush of the hills of this island. I focus today on stories of the island of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which was called Haiti by the indigenous people of the island. And these stories trouble the colonial mind and signal this island's role as a disturbance of Western modernity. Part 1, the insolent free Black. A few dozen brutal killings shook the Spanish colony of Santo Domingo in the late 18th century. Victims included enslaved people, free Black and mixed race Black people. And I will say mixed race Black people because this actually was a category that mattered within the context of the colonial framework, often called mulattoes. So the victims included enslaved people, free Black and mixed race Black people, white people, and domesticated animals who lived near or in cities. Terrified townspeople despaired at the loss of life and property. Colonial officials panicked at the potential connection between these crimes and the revolts that convulsed the western side of the island, Saint-Domingue, or soon to be Haiti or Haiti. In fact, Spanish colonial authorities could not send the men necessary to guard the border against potential spillover from next door because men were needed to look for and protect women and children from the killer. Authorities began to call the killer El Negro Incognito, or the unknown, unidentified, or disguised Black, since surviving victims described him as being Black, though with some phenotypical characteristics that evoked Arawak ancestry. So this sort of mixed raceness of Blackness and American indigeneity is really important to how people kept describing this killer. People would later also call him El Come Gente, or the People Eater, which alluded more to the violence of his killings and not to actual cannibalism, evidence of which was not found. And as I talk about El Negro Incognito, I'm building on the work of archivists and scholars like Casimiro de Moya, Carlos Jauregui, Raimundo Gonzalez, and Sarah E. Johnson. According to an account narrated by the priest Pablo Amezquita soon after the events, and then found written in a manuscript dated 1867, the manner in which El Negro Incognito murdered his victims, many of them enslaved men and women, left Amezquita with a feeling that failed language. He writes, "There are no words with which to ponder the compassion that arises from seeing the corpses so impiously destroyed," end quote. He then details some of the butchery, which included exorbitant maiming in the form of cutting the body open and removing entrails. In spite of the carnage the killer left in his wake, literary scholar Sarah E. Johnson reminds us that these hyperbolic forms of violence committed on people's bodies were endemic to a, quote, sadistic slaveholding society that mutilated its victims as a matter of control, end quote. Because many of the victims were enslaved people, the serial killer's actions seem to be driven by pure malevolence and sadism, rather than the revolutionary intent that led to the events now known as the Haitian Revolution, as Sarah Johnson herself argues. But it is also true that the slave revolt that lit the fuse of the Haitian Revolution was defined partly by Black people's usage of machetes to cut and maim white people in their homes. Dominican historian Raimundo Gonzalez provides the compelling interpretation that in spite of the seemingly indiscriminate manner of the violence, the murder of slaves, along with the destruction of harvests and the killing of cattle, was, quote, an attack on property itself, which is a really compelling argument. That is, slaves, like cattle and dwellings, were property, and as such, subject to the killer's destruction. To be clear, victims also included white people. However, the killer's actions are difficult to understand within the framework of slave rebellion or revolution because enslaved victims in this case were the prime loci of violence rather than collateral. The Spanish administration sent the lawyer Pedro Catani to find and capture the serial killer. Starting in 1782, Catani's plan consisted of searching for and rounding up, quote, Black idlers, thieves, runaway slaves, escaped convicts, and other criminals, end quote. If not proven to be El Come Gente himself, Catani forced captives to become legible to the colonial regime as hacienda laborers. This was, from a colonial perspective, a sensible course of action that got to the heart of the problem, which Catani soon realized was not only, or even most importantly, a serial killer on the loose. His travels confirmed that the real threat came in the form of free Black people, ungoverned, unsurveilled, and in webbed relation with each other. In an April 26, 1783 report to the governor of Santo Domingo, Joaquin Garcia, Catani exasperatedly concludes that there is not one single negro incognito. Instead, there are innumerable unsurveilled free Blacks. He writes, And this is my translation. Free Blacks are the worst. They locate themselves in the hills. They live how they want, freely and independently. They tend to be almost naked and are the cause and origin of all the damages that transpire and could occur on this island. To Kadani, the overwhelming power of the figure of the free Black was such that it could be blamed for any past, present, and future wrongdoing on the island. The figure of the free Black and free Black people themselves not only threatened colonial society, but also instigated an extraordinary anxiety for what I'm calling the colonial mind, though one could also call it the Western or European episteme. Kadani's recommendation to the government was to record where free Blacks lived and not allow them to live in lo más interior de los montes, which means in the most interior of hill spaces. Authorities were also to account for these dispersed Blacks every few months to ensure that they remained productive members of colonial society by tilling their assigned land. The surveillance of so-called free Blacks was of paramount importance in the maintenance of the colonial order, where it was not only legal slavery that organized Black life, but the idea of Black people as those who are meant to be and must be subjugated both within and beyond the law. And here I'm in conversation with scholars like Simone Brown, though she focuses more on 20th and 21st century US surveillance of Black people. Though a free man was tried and punished for the crimes committed, Kadani admitted that capturing this one individual did not address the core of the problem. In this sense, El Negro Incognito was the very inverse of the figure that literary scholar Gregory Pierrot theorizes as a Black Spartacus or Black Avenger in his really interesting book called The Black Avenger in Atlantic Culture. He writes, "The Black Avenger trope, used as it has long been in the service of resistance to racist oppression, always simultaneously contributed to maintain this system by promoting extraordinary individual Black heroism to the detriment of collective agency." El Negro Incognito wasn't a singular Black man, though the term isn't a singular. His unheroic unknowability made him instead pervasive. By pinpointing the culprit of these heinous acts as incognito, a term that connotes not only what is not known, but also what is camouflaged and unperceived, we leave the realm of heroic drama or tragedy and enter the realm of horror. The threat is faceless, potentially everywhere, multiple, and particularly horrifying from a colonial perspective, precisely because it seems to operate from sheer depravity and sagaciousness rather than political intent. It defies any categorization. It is, in other words, the Haitian free Black as insolent. And Haiti I'm using here to signify the island space itself, rather than one or another nation. The events attributed to El Negro Incognito so marked the Spanish colonial psyche that this tale emerges even today in the present day imaginary in parents' admonitions that if their children do not behave, el come gente will come for them. To Kadani's horror, El Negro Incognito was not only the unknown or unknowable Black, he was also every Black, everywhere, and at every time, past, present, and future, and his every move had the potential for malevolence. Part 2, Rituals of War. Writing against the notion that expects humanism to hold the key to solving the problem of the, quote, globalized sadism of anti-Blackness, Calvin Warren compellingly argues that, quote, the Black body provides form for a nothing that metaphysics works tirelessly to obliterate, end quote. And Calvin Warren is working in a metaphysical, philosophical tradition. Thusly, the Black person must endure what he calls a metaphysical holocaust in the face of the world's impossible desire to destroy its terror of the abyss. Frank B. Wilderson calls this, quote, spectacle of violence against Blacks a, quote, ritual of healing. And Tiffany Lethabo King uses the term bloodletting to describe the violence against, quote, Black and Indigenous communities since 1482. More directly, I think of ritual after Colin Diane, who argues that, quote, rituals considered otherworldly, primitive, irrational, and superseded maintain their presence in what we consider our truly civil and modern society, end quote. Put differently, the secular humanism that describes most of what is considered modernity in the world, built by European colonialisms, is not de-godded to adopt Sylvia Wynter's term, but has instead displaced its gods and devils to different sites. In many ways, secular humanism has moved, quote, the devil to the realm of that which should be repressed, but which nevertheless reemerges in symbolism as attached to Black objects, spaces, symbols, animals, and of course, people. The rituals of healing against Blackness echo, in many senses, the rituals against the devil himself. And I want to shout someone out here who's working on the figure of the devil and Blackness, and Cecilia Cooper, whose name I saw. I can't see the name now, so maybe they're not here, but I want to shout out their work, which is really interesting. Vodou does not take at face value the argument that secular humanism has made about itself. Vodou, in particular, the branches that interest me here, which are a set of spiritual militant practices born in the island of Haiti from African and Taino indigenous Maroons as a response of rage against colonialism, rightly assumes that European modernity as based in Christianity has always served its gods, whether they come in the form of saints or in the form of capitalism. What I consider here is how the symbols associated with Haiti and Vodou, especially stereotypical and racist images, instantiate precisely the power of certain nations of Vodou as tools of spiritual warfare that harness and instigate white fear of that which it tries and persistently fails to repress, the devil and the abyss. The abyss and darkness, though seemingly transcendental and universal ideas, have attached themselves voraciously to the bodies of Africans and Afro-descended people. Metaphoric as some representations of the Black Devil or Black Knight might be, the collapse of evil with Blackness and Blackness with Afro-descended people is almost total in every realm of European thought. What happens when we dive into the darkness and all that it might signify? We might find that this darkness is textured and even prismatic. We might find that it is not the absence of light, but the complicated communion with that which secular modernity has repressed, the godded earth and the habitual communication with the liminality between life and death. I build on Colin Diane's treatment of Vodou as, quote, intellectual puzzlement, the process of thought working itself through terror, that leads Diane to claim that Vodou practices must be viewed as ritual reenactments of Haiti's colonial past, end quote. And I'm also really indebted to the writing of Haitian anthropologist and Mambo or Vodou priestess Rachel Beauvoir Dominique, who actually is the daughter of the grand priest of Vodou, Max Beauvoir. Her writing on Vodou has really inspired me. She describes Vodou as manifesting an evolving symbol and as an evolving symbol system that expresses, quote, the logic of underground realms. What if we muse on how the colonial mind has grappled with Blackness in the Americas from a perspective that centralizes this logic of the underground realms? What I'm trying to do in this work is to consider a potential answer to this question. I argue that part of the answer lies in narratives of the figure of the free Black as the two sides of a coin personified on the island that now encompasses both Haiti, or characterized on the island that now encompasses both Haiti and the Dominican Republic. On one side of the coin is the insolent free Black who laughed in the face of colonial common sense through seemingly exorbitant physical and geographic movement. On the other side is the indolent free Black whose stillness is suspicious and seems to hide malevolence. The fear of the free Black is particularly pronounced in relation to Haiti for the obvious reason that Haiti was a nation born out of slave and maroon revolts. Moreover, the oft-repressed eastern side of the island, the Spanish colony of Santo Domingo, present-day Dominican Republic, had a majority or a large portion of Black population free Black population, starting at least as far back as the 17th century. Due to its marginal status as an impoverished Spanish colony, the oversight and control of this free Black population was relatively scarce. Pedro Catani and other Spanish colonial representatives had a slight problem when trying to find a negro incognito. Spain's neglect of this backwater colony meant that the population of Santo Domingo was composed of, depending on the source, around 1/3 to at least half free Black people who lived distantly from the centers of power. This is all the way from the 17th century or the 18th century. This is not to paint an idealized picture where free blacks enjoyed whatever freedom in a slaveholding society could possibly mean, but rather that the quotidian terrors of surveillance and punishment, so necessary to maintain colonial order, had not been pervasive on this territory for centuries by the time Kadani arrived. And this is a map of the island around the time, just a few years before the events of El Negro Incognito. The region that Caribbeanist historian Ann Eller calls the Center Island, which is geographically located in what is now the Dominican Republic, exemplifies this ecologically in place site of Haitian subterfuge. It's that region I circled there. There, especially in the region of the Vodou Mountains, fugitives from both the French and Spanish colonies fled for centuries, a practice that started with the Taínos who instigated the first rebellion against European colonialism in the Americas. The Vodou Mountains and the other areas that together comprise the Center Island pulsate with the underground realms of Vodou, as it provided the nexus for the militant Loas, or the gods of the Vodou pantheon called to help during revolts. The region, which includes mountains, caves, deserts, savannas, terrain considered inhospitable to the colonial enterprise, helped obscure and host maroon and unsurveilled free black movement and activity. I actually really like this map because it just shows you just how mountainous this island is. And it is not a coincidence that the modern day, present day plantation system that developed in the DR starting in the late 19th century is in that area to the east that is flat, right? So this majority mountainous region was difficult to control and to maintain control over. And in fact, Haiti means land of mountains in Arawak. Echoing both the indigenous Arawak name for the island and the Creole name for the nation on the western side, I use the word Haiti to designate the geographic and imaginary spaces that elude the border. The word means mountainous land in the Arawak language of the indigenous people of the island and evokes well my usage of the term the hills to describe those spaces in which European settlement has not leveled what sprouts beyond its common sense. And my intention here is not to sidestep the very real nation state of Haiti or Haiti, but to use a somewhat imperfect placeholder that for the most part does not obviously repeat the constraints on imagination and lifeways of the colonial mind. The hills, as both obfuscating ecology and imaginary of subterfuge, is the realm of the Haitian free black. The unruliness of the hills manifests as lands difficult to manipulate for capitalist production and profit, including wet swamps, dry savannas, and rocky mountains. And a cenote, by the way, is a water hole that is really beautiful. They're very, very beautiful and jewel-like, and they dot this savanna landscape, and they lead to underground riverine realms. So I find it particularly evocative of some of what I'm talking about. As other scholars have shown, however, this ecological unruliness, the land's unwillingness to yield to capitalist progress, has hosted Black indigenous and Black indigenous subterfuge throughout the Americas. Those who want to flee so-called modernity, the surveillance of various authorities, and forced labor laws and other forms of white supremacist violence have fled into the hills, El Monte, Les Morts, Le Grand Bois, La Manigua. I prefer the term the hills over a term like Marronage because what I'm discussing is more elusive and broader than those who were denominated Maroons. However, by using a term such as the hills rather than, for instance, fugitivity, I retain the relevance of geography and topography so entwined with the survival of the free Black person seeking to avoid colonial oversight. These Haitian hills lurk in the recesses of the colonial mind, even more horrific to it than the comprehensible narrative of slaves rebelling against their masters. And I heed the scholarly cautions against exceptionalizing Haiti. Michel Routrillo, for instance, critiques the long-term impulse to render Haiti special, which obscures hidden agendas that are, in short, racist and imperialist. Carlos Jauregui, writing about El Negro Incognito, argues that Haiti and the Haitian Revolution have been, quote, the object of a historiographic conjuring, end quote, which he notices evident not only in historiography but also in literary representation that, quote, rendered and still render Haiti a collection of horror stories and stereotypical images, end quote. I note these Marxist cautions as they apply to the countless narratives that otherize and indeed demonize Haiti, and which have helped abet anti-Black imperial discourses and military aggression. And I offer another caution. Understandable attempts to right the wrongs of anti-Blackness in myriad intellectual and political traditions that demonize Haiti cannot also be accompanied by the refutation of the spiritual and non-Western common sense elements that also thrive there. In other words, the revolutionary figures Francois Macandal and Boukman were also connected to Vodou, broadly speaking, is not something to dismiss. And I want to note that Cedric Robinson also sort of dismisses that spiritual element of the revolution. I ponder how religious, magical, and ritualistic practices that together comprise the various branches of Vodou have instilled terror in the European and colonial mind, and how these might be understood as explosive forms of retaliation against the perpetual state of war against Black people. And I'm going to my final part 3, the indolent free Black. Here's a quote to frame this last section by the scholar and publisher from the white Martinican elite, Emily Moreau de Saint-Méry. He writes, as servitude is nothing less than a veritable state of war, the slaves are and should be the enemies of their masters, and the sound of their chains ceaselessly warns the latter that vengeance is awake and stirring around them. And he's writing here on the eve of the Haitian Revolution. He knew the island very, very well. He traveled in both sides, throughout both sides. The 1943 film I Walked with a Zombie, directed by Jacques Tourneur, includes 2 arresting scenes, which both involve the character, or perhaps I should say the vessel of projection, named Carrefour. And I'm going to show you the trailer. One sec.
And out of their West Indian island comes a tale of terror and voodoo, of witchcraft and zombies, and all the weird black magic that the white man seldom sees. It is a tale of brother against brother and their love for a woman who lived with the dead. And it is also the tale of a young nurse who never believed such things could happen.
Are you trying to tell me that the voodoo priest could cure Mrs. Holland? Better doctors. Dambala, this woman is ill.
This is the ceremony of voodoo death, a ceremony that seeks the life of the woman who lives forever, who walks with the dead.
So, although the musical traditions and other signifiers throughout this film evoke stereotypes of Haiti, the island setting is called Saint Sebastian. So it's a very thinly veiled representation of Haiti, and it was in fact based on a story by a female journalist who traveled to Haiti and wrote of her account of encountering a zombie. Carrefour as a name, as well as Carrefour's position at a crossroads guarding the road at night, recalls the Loa of the crossroads himself, Cafu, a creolization of Carrefour. And this is the character as we first encounter him in the film. Rachel Pouvois-Dominique describes Cafu as the Loa of the abyss, quote unquote, that is a necessary prelude to take off in the Petuo branch of Vodou, which most scholars agree is associated with the Loas who represent and encompass the rage against enslavement and colonialism. It was, in fact, a Petuo ceremony where a black pig was sacrificed that is credited with lighting the fuse that would start the Haitian Revolution. It is also Petuo that is associated with the Vodou practice in the Central Island region I pointed to above, meaning it is Petuo that is the branch of Vodou that Dominicans more likely practice rather than the other branches of Vodou. And finally, the black pig is significant in that the eastern side of the island, what is now the Dominican Republic, was dominated by people who lived by an economy of people who lived in the hills, living precisely from the hunt of wild black boars. And these people were called monteros. Petuo, in other words, is at the heart of the Haitian hills as that which transcends the imposed border and which also defies conversations about Haiti and the DR that rely on the nation-state model and discussions of nationalist and even ethnic identities. But the film certainly doesn't get at any of these complexities. To begin with, Carrefour here, whom you see, is not a Loa, but a zombie, controlled by the Vodou priest. To be clear, the Haitian zombie on which the idea of the zombie in Hollywood is based is a person who becomes a zombie through the creation of a concoction by a knowledgeable practitioner who focuses on the left hand of Vodou. The Bokor does this in order to control the person in perpetuity, and many have rightfully described the state of the Haitian zombie as echoing the state of enslavement. In this scheme, the Haitian zombie is seen as a victim rather than as a monster to be feared. So this is an important distinction between the Haitian zombie and then what would become the zombie trope in films like Night of the Living Dead, etc. Returning to the film, the two white women who encounter Carrefour as they cross a sugarcane field at night are Jessica Holland and her nurse, Betsy Connell, the nurse has been summoned from Canada by her husband, Paul Holland, to tend to his wife, the titular zombie. So I Walked with a Zombie is alluding to the white woman zombie, not Carrefour, which is interesting. With the directions of Alma, the black maid at the Holland household, and the talismans she attaches to their lapels, the two women can safely cross into the sanctuary of the Ungan, or Vodou priest, during what the assumed viewer would consider a voodoo ceremony. Betsy is motivated to attend the ceremony to find a cure for Jessica's state. Betsy and the viewers encounter Carrefour bare feet first, and her gaze follows that of the camera as it pans up along the formidable figure of a tall, black, and bare-chested man. And I think there was a very short clip of that in the trailer. Carrefour echoes descriptions of El Come Gente in some respects, who was described as usually naked or semi-naked, lacking in any language proper, and always emerging from the wilderness or foliage that will again hide him. And Carrefour doesn't say a single word throughout this film. So he sort of is beyond language or underneath language or before language. He doesn't seem to register the two women as Betsy stares at him with shock and awe. His face remains completely still and placid. He is almost gently smiling. His eyes, however, are uncannily and grotesquely flat and unseeing. Betsy's eyes are alert, hungry for comprehension and absorption of information, while Jessica's, though a zombie herself, daintily turned downward in mute submissiveness. As Betsy pulls Jessica to continue on their nocturnal journey, the cinematography provides another vision of Carrefour in complete shadow, as an impenetrable black shape disrupting the moonlit night. It is no coincidence that one of the most popular genres of horror in Hollywood film is based on the Haitian zombie turned zombie. And although the popular genre now has little or nothing to do with Haiti, the earliest zombie film, White Zombie, was set in Haiti. I Walked with a Zombie and White Zombie is from 1932. I Walked with a Zombie is another early zombie film set in a fictional island clearly inspired by stereotypes of Haiti. These early zombie films provided an avenue through which the colonial mind disciplined the threatening idea of revolutionary and modern Haiti as the site where the Black primitive staunchly thrives instead of being modernized through enslavement. Instead of having been modernized through enslavement. This stereotype obscures not only the achievement of modernity that was the Haitian Revolution, whose conceptualization of freedom was more nearly universal than any of the white Creole nations' pro-slavery independence movements. It also obscures something I would argue is more nefarious and irksome, that what thrived on this island was an anti-colonial response that the colonial mind fails to put to language. I Walked with a Zombie is clearly inspired by US ideas about Haiti, particularly resonant due to the US military occupation there from 1915 to 1934. The very premise of the film seeks to annihilate what had been so threatening about Haiti since 1804, a state founded on Black sovereignty and the end of slavery. But the annihilation is not complete, for Carrefour haunts the film visually to such an extent that his presence is precisely to blame both for its narrative incoherence and visual nonsense. His utter stillness in the midst of a sugarcane field becomes a grotesque exaggeration of the figure of the indolent Black who refuses to work. But unlike the many political cartoons that transform performances of Black leisure or refusal to work into minstrelsy and comedy, Carrefour's stillness operates in the realm of horror and the Freudian uncanny as that which lurks in the realm of the familiar, including the home, as I will show you in a second. As a zombie in the original Haitian sense, Carrefour works for the priest and as such evades the logic of work in any colonial and capitalist sense. Free Blacks were charged with indolence not only when at leisure, but quite simply when their modes of moving in the world were not consonant with colonial and capitalist common sense. Within colonial and colonialist national frameworks, the free Black had to continuously prove that he or she was not idle, either through documents or demonstrable performances of work, and only work could demonstrate his or her worthiness in being where he or she was. This is evident in the law and in the documents that abet the law in the form of pamphlets and documents that existed to inculcate and discipline the Black throughout the Americas. In her discussion of how indolence emerges in a post-1865 US archive, Saidiya Hartman proposes, quote, that the advent of freedom was plagued with anxieties about Black indolence, end quote. Hoping to secure the entitlements of whiteness for formerly enslaved people, Hartman continues, many African American organizations extol the virtues of, quote, self-discipline and restraint, as well as hard work and dispassionate acquisitiveness. But this is not only in the US. Martinican thinker Edouard Glissant describes an 1848 circular posted all over Martinique, which exhorted field slaves to understand that freedom is not the right to wander aimlessly, but the right to work for oneself, end quote. The official who's writing here warns these quote-unquote field slaves to pay no heed, especially to those free idlers, and to respond to them, go to work and let us deserve our freedom, end quote. The etymology of the word indolence acquires a prismatic valence when looked at through Blackness in the Americas. Indolence comes from Latin indolentia, or freedom from pain. According to the online etymology dictionary, by 1710, indolence meant laziness or love of ease and could be distinguished from a phrase like taking pains, defined as working hard or striving hard to do. End quote. The idea of freedom from pain hints at the possibility of indolence as a sign of freedom from colonial violence, at the same time that it suggests that Blackness as indolence is also Blackness as unfeeling flesh. A word often used to describe free Blacks not clearly performing acceptable forms of labor was idle. In the Old German, English, and Dutch, this word has been associated with the words empty, bare, and useless. In Spanish, the word that correlates to indolence is the adjective vago, meaning both lazy and vague. This word has roots in vacío, or that which is empty or vacuous, and has a shared history to the word vacación or vacation, and vanidad or vanity. Saidiya Hartman defines Black fungibility through the notion of, quote, the captive body as a vessel for the uses, thoughts, and feelings of others, end quote. We can thus map an associative relationship between Black fungibility and the empty, vessel-like structure of the figure of the idle Black. Carrefour's appearance is both the grotesque exaggeration of indolence as stillness, and since he always appears in shadow as the form of the unfeeling, he appears as both literal shadow and as a total Black figure in a gray-toned and silvery moonlit night. The cinematography, set design, and lighting of the scene I describe exaggerate the darkness of his skin so that he looks like his own shadow, and you can see this here. And later, in another arresting moment of the film, we encounter Carrefour as the sound of his feet, and only his feet, we don't see him, and they are shuffling in an otherwise totally silent night. It's actually very eerie and really, really powerful and strange. Soon after, we see his shadow, not him. And the scholar Elizabeth Paravicini-Gebert describes this shadow that we see as a phallic shadow moving across the walls of Betsy's room as he approaches Jessica's inner sanctum. So there's what we see after we see the shuffling. In this scene, the film traffics in the history of US film is based on anxieties about Black men raping white women. Right, I mean, this is kind of obvious here. But in spite of all this, the film never gives in fully to this threat of the white woman's contamination through contact with Blackness, whether sexual or otherwise. And I aver that what makes Carrefour so threatening is that he is almost always a shadow. So I disagree with the idea that what is threatening is that he's a potential rapist. I think what's scarier in this film is that he is a shadow as a lucid signifier of the nonsense that colonialism and European modernity cannot fully assimilate. And Carrefour then is the fleshy shadow that is the vessel of all that haunts and horrifies the colonial mind, which I argue is the free Black. In spite of all these vicissitudes, and though it is redolent in the expected racist imagery of a Hollywood portrayal of a Caribbean island, this strange and incoherent film demonstrates the echoes of the IT and underground networks of anti-colonial communication. It does this in spite of itself. And this is as it must be, for what I have discussed today distinctly cannot be represented mimetically or even through certain norms of abstraction. The IT world of the hills that I write about emerged out of rage against colonialism, and it reemerges in part in the form of that which haunts the colonial imagination, its nightmares, its shadows, and its greatest fears. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ramirez. Okay, and we are now for this really fascinating and multifaceted talk. And we now welcome your questions and comments. While we're waiting for our audience to gather their thoughts and put them in writing, I just wanted to, I like the image of the unruliness of the hills. Mm-hmm. And I found the juxtaposition of the hills and what the hills signified, a place of escape, creativity, these threatening free Blacks juxtaposed against the zombie in the fields. And I'm assuming those are sugarcane plantations, which would be on the flats, as places that are acceptable to white people because they are taking walks, at night in the in the cane fields in the flat, whereas the freed Blacks in the hills are unreachable, untouchable, threatening, whereas in a sense, the zombies are controlled and contained. I found that a very fascinating juxtaposition. I have a question about how you see the hills as operating in contemporary, the island contemporarily, especially, is it still a space of creativity and freedom and escape that is beyond capitalist exploitation, or does it operate differently in contemporary Haiti and Dominican Republic?
Thank you so much for that observation and question. That's a really difficult question because I don't want to, the hills absolutely remains because what is anti-colonial always remains. It is always there in some form. And I hear of the hills, one hears of the hills on the island through stories mostly, but I have been fascinated by how much they emerge in storytelling as in the vein of horror. I find that absolutely fascinating. And it's almost like that form of anti-colonial, I don't want to say struggle, but anti-colonial grammar in a sense is so subversive of the colonial mind and which includes the nation state, that it can only come up as terrifying. So that interests me. And I think that, but I do think that it becomes more difficult for the hills to sort of instantiate, for lack of a better word, for the simple fact that now there's just more surveillance over more places. So what a central component of the hills is to evade surveillance, to evade capture, not only literal physical capture, but also capture by the imaginary and discursive capture. And that has become increasingly difficult. But I will say that speaking with some Haitian scholars, there are ways in which there are certain religious and spiritual practices that to me evoke this kind of militant hills that I'm talking about. Because it's also not, what I'm talking about here is also not only escapist and beautiful, it's also war. It's literally a state of war. And that's part of what I'm retaining, that element of horror and fear that is militant. And the way that fear, I argue, in some branches of Vodou, and some arts of Vodou, actually, there's art that accompanies Vodou that that makes use of others' fear, right, to terrify in an act of war. But there's a lot more of thinking I have to do.
Okay, thanks. So there are some questions here. PJ Moisette says, thanks for the presentation, extremely engaging. My question relates to the Hollywood film industry. It's a fact that Hollywood industry is extremely liberal, from actors to writers to studio executives, yet the films currently being made in the same manner that the film you shared continue to racialize and marginalize people of color, in addition to often limiting the representation of racial, ethnic, minority filmmakers and actors. In your opinion, why do you think Hollywood does not get it? Or better said, how can people that claim to be liberal yet promote an industry that is separate and unequal? PJ.
Thank you, PJ. I mean, I think I'm going to oversimplify the answer, but the answer is kind of simplistic, and that is because Hollywood is white supremacist and anti-Black. That's it. That's the beginning and the end of it. Yeah, that's I think liberal humanism is based on the colonial mind, and as such, liberalism does not mean it is not white supremacist or Eurocentric. It is. It was invented to protect Europe and to allow Europe to rise as in world power.
Okay, thank you for that. Brian Meeks has two questions for you. Really enjoyed it, Dixa. Have you read Eric Hobsbawm's little book, Bandits? I thought it might be useful in terms of your discussion of the individual rebel and their relationship to collective struggle. So that's a more common question. And the second question is, can you elaborate your distinction between your approach and the more established notions of marronage and fugitivity, or are you not making a distinction?
Thanks, Brian, for that wonderful suggestion. I haven't read it, but I wrote it down. I'm definitely going to be looking it up as I continue to work on this. And with your second question, I've thought a lot about this, a lot for years now. How am I distinguishing these terms, the hills versus marronage versus fugitivity? And I'll say that I write about this a little bit in the introduction of the book, and I'll just share a little bit of that with you now, which is, I like the term the hills because it translates into a word that I think most Spanish speakers are familiar with, which is el monte. And it connotes something that isn't just spatial and geographic or topographical. It is also an imaginary. And this imaginary, and the Latin American and Caribbean imaginary, has instigated feelings of fear that to me are a fear of that which is supposed to remain repressed in modernity. And I do think the hills captures that to some extent, right? I think Run for the Hills or the hills have eyes. I think that, and hill people as emerging consistently in horror tropes as like a kind of other that has not been properly modernized or become properly modern, as existing in discord and in dissonance with modernity and the nation state, is interesting to me, in a way that Marronage to me is very clearly a very specific, it is guerrilla warfare. It is to live in a community of people that are in a state of war against colonial or national oversight. So Marronage to me is very specific. And I think that Marronage, and then when it gets into fugitivity and some discussions in Black studies, I think have become quite metaphorical, where it has become to some extent unmoored from that Caribbeanist anti-colonial context that I'm talking about. And I think a word like the hills connotes some of the not only geographic specificity that I find super crucial, the topography, the landscape was super important to this kind of guerrilla warfare as an anti-colonial mode, and knowledge about the local ecology, but also something more discursive. And I think the hills and El Monte tie those things together in a way that Marronage, which I respect and find, I have a very literal interpretation of Marronage. And fugitivity, which has become really unmoored. It has come to mean a lot of different things. So yeah, that's how I differentiate between these terms, and try to place my work in relation to that, of course.
Okay. Since this is connected, I'll just read it, but then I'll go to Erica Durante's question. Bran has said, thanks, this helps a lot. Have you read the Jamaican reggae group Burning Spears? If We Should Live Up in the Hills? It's a theme song for your ideas.
Thank you. I'm going. No, once you think about the hills and El Monte, you find references everywhere. There's this really amazing saying in the DR, and I don't know if other Spanish speakers say it, but it's fuera de la capital, Monte Culebra, which means beyond the capital, it's just hills and snakes. And to me, capital, it just means Santo Domingo, but it also connotes like capital, like Marxist capital. Beyond capitalism is just the hills and snakes. But yeah, once you have your ear open to the hills, you kind of hear it everywhere. I'm just writing this down.
Thank you. It's a lovely piece of music too.
Oh, good.
Erica Durante says, thanks so much for your inspiring research. I was thinking of Alejo Carpentier and the notion of marvelous rail that he first identified in Haiti. How is it relevant for your understanding of the stereotypes associated with Black people in the island and voodoo rituals? I'll read the other one when you're finished with this one.
Well, I just taught Alejo Carpentier in my Caribbean Lit class, and I mean, the short answer to that question, and actually I think there's someone present here who has written about this. Hold on, is he here, Adrian? Is Adrian here? Yes, Adrian wrote something really smart about this, and I'll just say that Alejo Carpentier was inspired by Haiti and the Haitian Revolution, but the book is extraordinarily stereotypical. And I'm not surprised that he was inspired precisely by Black anti-colonial modes of being in the world rather than other forms of anti-colonialism, because there's something more complete about it, right? It is the Haitian Constitution that says, from the very first line, slavery is forever abolished. And this is in 1804 or 1805, when slavery was raging all over the Americas. So it's not surprising that it would be the Haitian Revolution that would inspire him to think about something that he would consider universal, but at the same time, the specificity of anti-Blackness is something he completely misses. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Can Erica be promoted as a panelist so she can ask a question? Is that possible, Ellen?
Sure, hold on one sec.
Great, thanks. So Erica, I'd let you ask this question. If there's anybody else who wants to ask a question or, interact with Dixa, please let us know. I think that's, better than me trying to read these questions. Over to you, Erica.
Hi, Erica.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Adriana. I will read about what you wrote on Carpentier too. So my question was about the cenotes, and I wasn't aware of the fact there were cenotes on the island. I know like Mayan cenotes, like more in Yucatan Peninsula and Guatemala. So I was wondering whether they have the same meaning that they have for the Mayans, like this communication with the infraworld. If you can expand a bit more on this.
Thank you for that question. And I encountered cenotes first in Yucatan.
Yes.
And then I hadn't been to this part of the island, even though my family's from that region. My mom's side of the family, I hadn't been there where the cenotes are. So when I saw them and I read more about them, I was absolutely fascinated. I also didn't know they were there. And the way that I'm thinking of them and how I talked about them in the talk is more how I'm metaphorizing them. They are indeed these geological formations that do lead to underground river networks that are very, very important. Factually, they're very important for the wildlife there, but as well as the people who manage to live there, because it is a very dry savanna landscape. So they are actually important lifeways, and they have been for centuries. And the way I talked about them more as connected to this underground realm is taking that literal, they are connected to underground riverine realms. And I found that to be a fascinating juxtaposition with the Rachel Beauvoir-Dominique, the anthropologist, and Mambo talking about Vodou as metaphorically an underground realm. I found that to be very poetically interesting, considering she herself notes that Vodou writ large started on this island in that region specifically of the Vodou Mountains. So I found that to be, I'm just sort of riffing on that concept. And I want to learn more about the significance of Mayan cenotes for sure. Right. Because that culture was connected to some extent, right? This indigenous culture. So I wonder if there was some overlapping significance. But caves were extremely important to Taínos, extremely. Caves and rivers are two of the most significant sort of ecologies in this island, and this is part of the Taino legacy for Maroons. This is why I think it's not only African, it's very much Amerindian as well, and it's very native to the island.
Yeah, and I think we also find some similar patterns also about indigenous people, like in the Andes, where altitudes on the one hand, and then also caves, and then mines later on. I mean, will become also like sort of islands of like protective islands, right? From explorers or colonizers.
Yeah, and it's almost like these ecological formations that are precisely anathema to the colonizer, because it's like, well, how are you going to level? Like, there's no gold here, or we can't like plant a bunch of sugar here. It literally does not. It becomes exactly the place of where indigenous and then Black Maroons could live away from surveillance and make other kinds of lifeways, and also live from the land differently than the way European colonizers thought land should be used agriculturally.
Brian, I see you have a comment here. Would you like to be elevated to this panelist so you can raise it? The comment. In the meantime, Adrian says, thank you, Dixa. Oh, he said no.
Oh, he's
thank
gone.
You, Dixa, for this amazing and for this important discussion, Erica. I have to head to class. Looking forward to continuing the conversation offline. And Brian's comment is also in Jamaica, though not called cenotes, but there's an area called the Cockpit Country, that provided the geographic relief for the Maroons to survive and their ability to battle the British to a truce and treaty, which brings me back to my question of whether these places are still outside of capitalist exploitation, because right now there's a struggle in Jamaica to stop the government from allowing permits to explore for bauxite and other minerals within the cockpit countries. So as technology advances, as more accessible deposits of ore and other minerals are drying up, then I think the hills are being opened up increasingly as a site of capitalist exploitation.
Absolutely. No, sorry to interrupt. I was going to add someone else who I'm thinking with a lot is Kamal Brathwaite and his struggles in his last years to protect his land, cow pasture, which he saw as, he wanted to make it a kind of artistic maroon space, not necessarily literally maroonage, but certainly a space that where Black people could live in subsistence, right? And kind of away from this form of capitalism and surplus. And he failed. I mean, in the sense that, I mean, in one sense of failure, which is that the government, I think they wanted to take it over. At first it was for an airport road. And he was like, why do we need more airport road? And I think later on it was to build condos that were going to be sold to people to foreigners, right? And for foreign capital. And so absolutely that, it becomes very depressing.
And then when we factor in climate change and the inevitable rush from the courses, then we're headed to the hills. So.
And that's why I'm someone who in my work, I can't find prescriptions or solutions because I'm always interested in complicating things. I'm a lit person. I'm not going to solve any problems anytime soon. But I am really inspired to think with artists who I think are, whether writers or choreographers. I'm thinking with a choreographer, Ligia Lewis, who's from the DR, but based in Berlin, and how this idea of the hills is reflected or instantiates in artwork. Maybe not in the physical material realm, but in an imaginary realm. And I'm thinking through that, how that emerges in those spaces as they continue to be obliterated in material reality. Yeah.
Brand should have being allowed himself to be promoted because he's saying, indeed, thanks for raising what were you saying? Yeah, I don't know why he should be here having a discussion. Erica wrote something.
Yes, I'm writing it down. Morros and cerros around this. Yeah. I mean, the idea of El Monte in connection and also not in connection to maroonage is something that, even though I'm focusing on Haiti and the DR, it is something you find throughout the Americas, including the US. Though in the US, I think this space has been really repressed in US imaginaries. But I focus on Haiti and the DR because it was the place of Haitian Revolution. And it becomes shorthand, the Haitian Black, it becomes shorthand for all that colonialism is terrified of. Insurrection, right? And so how does Haiti as an island tap into that fear? It really fascinates me.
Esther Whitfield has a question. Thank you so much.
Hi, Esther.
I'm really interested in how you think of El Monte, and I'm wondering how Lilia Cabrera's text El Monte and his detailed ethnographic description of religious practices relates to spatial questions about El Monte that seem so important in your work. Also in Cuba, La Loma and El Monte seem to be words for the hills with different cultural connotations. Do you see this elsewhere?
Yeah, thank you so much, Esther, for that question. Yeah, I am absolutely very aware of Lidia Cabrera's work, and I'm interested in it, and I find it curious how I'm more interested in, rather than her descriptions of El Monte, even though in those descriptions it also becomes clear that this space is not only literal and geographic, but also a religious, spiritual, imaginary that taps into something that is not European. So that is very much consonant with everything I've been thinking about. And with her, I'm more curious about how she is in relation to this as a white Cuban woman of the elite, and how it is that she made her name based on that, kind of like Alejo Carpentier made his name based on Black spiritual practices. Like, I find that relationship more interesting than her actual writing, and its relationship to the rise of in anthropology. And the reason I say that is because like, even the film, I didn't have time to get into this, but I'm going to be writing about how the film sort of seesaws, I Walk with a Zombie, it seesaws between Blackness as anthropology and Blackness as horror. And so I find that seesaw particularly instructive in relation to the fact that a lot of what we know about Vodou and other Black spiritual practices that emerged in the Americas, we necessarily know them, unless we're practitioners ourselves, we know them through anthropology, and we also then know them in horror film. So I find that fascinating, the fact that Afro-religious practice emerges in these two genres. But that's a very impartial answer, but yes, I am thinking with Lydia Cabrera, but maybe not directly, maybe sideways. And yeah, La Loma, I haven't heard La Loma. I'm not familiar if La Loma comes up in the way I'm thinking of, but I define in the book how I mean the hills or el monte differently than words like el campo, for example, or la montaña and other terms like that, because el campo to me signifies like a rural idol, like something that has been dominated already and controlled. And El Monte is beyond control. It's exactly what you cannot control. And I'm not sure if La Loma is similar to El Campo. I would be curious about that.
And so would you like to be promoted to our panelists so you can elaborate?
Maybe not. Oh, or maybe yes.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you. If there's anybody else who would prefer to speak their question and comments rather than put them in the chat, please let us know. Hi, Esther.
It's really cool, Dix, and I'm glad to talk to you about this work again. No, La Loma, there's Son de la Loma is like one of the sort of classic Guajiro songs. So it's very consonant with what you're saying, is that you can sort of analyze this sort of, this rural essence within certain recognizable confines in a way that even with contrasting that with Cabrera's El Monte, you couldn't. So it's very consonant.
Well, and Esther, thank you for clarifying that further, because what's fascinating to me, even thinking about the DR and the space of what is now the DR, like my mom's side of the family comes from the Black Mountain region, or the region associated with Los Brujos, the region I talked about. So that's one, but then my dad is from the other mountain region, which is also mountains, but it's like the White Mountain. So it's like the Loma versus the Monte, and it's fascinating because topographically they're similar. It's just mountains.
Right, it's not the
What's that?
It's not just the topography that defines them, right? It's
the way it emerges in the national imaginary, and similar to Cuba and Puerto Rico, the idea of the campesino, the Guajiro, is almost always whitened in a national imaginary, and that's very different from like the witch doctor of the Black space, who is a rural entity but not a campesino.
I also wanted to say, Dixa, I lived in Venezuela about 30 years ago, and then there was a saying then, Caracas es Caracas y lo demás es Monte y Culebra.
Oh, interesting. So it does. Oh my God, no, that's really useful for me to know.
Traveled, but it was around a long time ago.
No, I'm glad, because I've been asking around and nobody could confirm, but I suspect that it's something that you hear throughout the Americas. Yeah. Thank you.
Would you guys like to translate that, Esther? Caracas is Caracas.
Yeah, Caracas is Caracas, and everything else is Monte and snakes.
Oh,
So the same saying that Dixa said she'd heard recently in the Dominican
Yes.
Republic, it was, you know, I heard it and in Venezuela a very long time ago. So it's
Wow.
kind of interesting.
But I love that saying because it connotes exactly. It's almost like I don't even have to write a book. Just like that.
Yeah.
That's the
Right.
phrase. That's it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Well, if not, I really want to thank you, Dixa, for this really fascinating and wide-ranging talk. And
Thank you for having me.
And to our audience for engaging your wonderful questions and comments and staying with us. I really appreciate it. Before you go, I just want to remind you that our next event is on Thursday, and we will be having a talk by our cohort visiting professor, Lucilla Niamkis. So the socio-environmental, sorry, let me start again. Her topic is socio-environmental strategies for strengthening the resilience of women migrant workers in the Reconquista area of Buenos Aires. And this is this Thursday at noon. So please, if you are available, it would be great to have you. So thank you, everybody. And Dixa, thank you so much.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
And I'm looking forward to the Duke book.
Me too. All right. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, thanks, Ellen, and
yes,
and
thank you.
and Kate and Alex. Thank you all so much.